The first call I ever made to my daughter was from a payphone outside the delivery room because I'd left my wallet inside and I needed to hear someone say her name out loud. The last call she made to me said I wasn't welcome at the place I'd spent $38,000 to take her. Somewhere between those two phone calls, I stopped being her father and started being her funding source. Welcome, friends. My name isn't important yet. You'll have it in a moment. But before we get into this, do me a favor, drop the city you're watching from down in the comments below. And if you've ever given everything to someone who treated it like it was nothing, hit subscribe. Because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. My wife's name was Loretta, 31 years married, and I never once heard her raise her voice at a stranger. Not once. She taught 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary in Knoxville for 22 years, and every August, before the school year started, she'd drive to the Dollar Tree on Kingston Pike and spend $200 of her own money on pencils and folders and those little plastic pencil cases with the snap lids because she knew which kids in her class weren't going to show up with supplies, and she didn't want them to feel the difference. She never put it on a reimbursement form. She never mentioned it to the principal. I found out because I found the receipts in her glove box one September, 8 years into our marriage. And when I asked her about it, she just said, "Harold, those are little people. They didn't choose their situation." That was Loretta, in a sentence. She had a wooden box on her dresser that she'd inherited from her grandmother, a woman named Bridget who had come over from County Clare in Ireland in 1951 with $40 and a sewing kit. Inside the box were 3 things: a photograph of Bridget standing outside a small stone church in a village called Kilmehill, a pressed flower that had gone brown and papery with age, and a handwritten note in Irish that Loretta had never been able to get fully translated. She kept the box where she could see it every morning. When I asked her once why she never moved it, she said, "Because she carried something all the way across the ocean and never put it down. The least I can do is remember that." She got her diagnosis in the winter of 2022. Ovarian. Caught later than anyone would have wanted. I was there for every appointment, every scan, every conversation with every doctor who used words I had to write down and look up later in the truck. 14 months. I learned more about medicine in those 14 months than I had in the previous 62 years of my life, and none of it was enough. In her last weeks, lying in that adjustable bed we'd rented and set up in the living room so she could see the backyard, she talked about Ireland. Not constantly, but it would come up in the evenings when the light was going and she was resting between the hard parts. She talked about Bridget's village. She'd always wanted to go. We talked about it for years as a someday thing, a retirement thing, a thing we'd do when there was more time, and then suddenly there was less time than either of us had planned for, and she knew it. "Harold," she said to me one evening, about 3 weeks before the end, "take Cassie, take the grandkids, go to Kilmile, find that church in the photograph. I want somebody in this family to stand in front of it." I told her we'd all go together. She smiled at me the way she did when she was being patient with me. "You'll go," she said. "Promise me." My name is Harold Briggs. I'm 63 years old. I run a small engine repair shop called Briggs & Son on Merchant Drive in Maryville, Tennessee, the same one my father started in 1974, though the son in the name is now a matter of some irony since I only have a daughter. I have spent the better part of my adult life being the kind of man who doesn't make waves. I fix things quietly. I pay things quietly. I let things go that probably should have been said out loud a long time ago. Loretta used to call it my gift and my curse in the same breath. My daughter's name is Cassie. She's 34. She married a man named Derek Holloway 6 years ago, and from the first Thanksgiving he attended, I could see that Derek had opinions about how Cassie's time and money and attention ought to be organized, and most of those opinions pointed away from me. I told myself for 6 years that I was imagining it. I told myself what fathers of daughters tell themselves when they see something they don't want to see. I started planning the Ireland trip the spring after Loretta passed. I'm not a travel person. I'd never booked anything more complicated than a cabin in the Smokies before this. But I found a travel planner named Susan Merritt at a firm over in Farragut. And over the course of nearly 2 years, I put together what I can only describe as the most deliberately planned thing I have ever done in my life. A 2-week trip to Ireland, flights from Knoxville through Dublin, a rental cottage in County Clare for 9 days, a private guide for a day trip to Kilmeal, a visit to the church in the photograph. I had a copy of Bridget's photograph enlarged and framed and wrapped in a linen cloth inside my suitcase for 2 years before we ever flew anywhere, because I wanted to have it ready. The total cost over those 2 years came to $38,400. Flights, accommodations, the guide, a group dinner in Ennis that Susan helped me arrange, an extra night in Dublin on either end. I paid it in installments, the way Susan laid it out. And I never once asked Cassie or Derek to contribute a single dollar because this was my promise, and I intended to keep it entirely on my own terms. Cassie knew about the trip from the beginning. She'd cried when I told her what her mother had asked. She'd hugged me in the kitchen on Sycamore Lane and said, "Dad, that's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." Derek had been quieter, but I'd put that down to Derek being Derek. What I didn't know, and what I should have asked about before I'd paid for it, was how much space Derek had been quietly taking up in my daughter's head on the subject of this trip. I didn't know because I didn't ask, and I didn't ask because she was my daughter, and you don't put your daughter in a deposition about her own motivations. That was my flaw. I carried my whole life without asking the questions I should have asked, because I assumed love made the answers obvious. It was a Tuesday in March, 6:20 in the morning. I remember because I'd already been up for an hour. I opened the shop at 7 on Tuesdays, and I was standing at the kitchen counter drinking coffee when my phone lit up on the counter beside the sugar jar. A text from Cassie. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I want to do it now before I lose my nerve. Derek and I talked, and we think the Ireland trip should just be us and the kids. His parents are coming through that week, and he thinks it would be a good time for them to join us. I know that's not what was planned, but, he says, the itinerary you set up is actually perfect for a family trip. I'm sorry. I love you." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, because I was looking for the part that made sense. I called her. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. "Cassie." That was all I said. "Dad, please don't be upset." Her voice had that stretched sound, the one she'd had since she was 9 years old, when she was trying to hold two things together that weren't compatible. "Your mother's mother's grandmother built a life from nothing, so that your mother could exist and love you," I said. "And your mother made me promise, on one of the last nights she was well enough to talk clearly, that we would go stand in front of that church in Kilmahill, together. That's what this trip is." Silence. "Derek thinks." "I'm not asking what Derek thinks," I said. And then I stopped myself, because raising my voice at her was not something I was willing to do. "Tell me what you think." Another silence, longer. And then, "I think it's going to be a lot to process emotionally, Dad. And Derek says if we have his parents there, it'll feel less heavy, less like a grief trip." I stood in that kitchen and I looked at the window above the sink, and I thought about the wooden box on Loretta's dresser. I'd moved it to the mantel after she passed, so it wasn't somewhere I'd see it first thing every morning and come apart before I'd gotten my shoes on. "Cassie," I said, "this is not a grief trip. This is a promise I made to your mother." "I know," she said. "I know, Dad. Derek already told his parents and they've already looked at flights, and I don't know how to undo that now." "You let me know," I said, "what you decide." I hung up. Not in anger. I hung up the way you put a tool down when you realize the job has changed and you need a minute to figure out what it actually is now. She texted 4 hours later. "Derek's parents are so excited. I think you'll really like them once you get to know them better. We can still do the church. I'll make sure." I didn't respond that day. Instead, I drove over to the shop, locked myself in the back office where I keep the books, and I sat with a legal pad and a pen for about 45 minutes. I'm not an emotional man in the way people mean when they say that. I feel things. I just feel them slowly and in private, and by the time they come out, they've been through a process that tends to end in a decision rather than a scene. By the time I left that office, I had made 3 decisions. The first was to call Susan Merritt. "Susan," I said, "I need to go through the reservation structure with you. Walk me through what's in my name versus what's in the group booking." She pulled up the file, and we spent 20 minutes on the phone going through it. The cottage in County Clare was in my name, paid in full. The private guide for the Kilmahill Day was booked under my name through her firm. The group dinner reservation in Ennis was mine. The return flights had been booked individually. I had paid for Cassie and Derek's tickets and the children's as a gift, but those tickets were in their names once issued. "The flights I can't touch," she said. "Those are theirs now. But the cottage, the guide, the dinner, those are all yours. You could modify or cancel any of them." "What about if I kept my booking and went separately?" I asked. "Could we restructure it so my reservation is independent and the rest of the group accommodation is just removed?" She was quiet for a moment. "I could cancel the cottage and book you a smaller place in Kilmahill or Ennis for just yourself. You'd lose some of the deposit on the cottage, maybe $400. Everything else transfers." "Do it," I said. Susan paused. "Harold, can I ask?" "Please," I said. "Do it." The second decision I made was to call my attorney. Her name is Patricia Crane, and she had handled Loretta's estate. I told her I wanted to revisit my will. Loretta's house on Sycamore Lane, the house we'd lived in for 19 years, the house where Cassie had grown up, where Loretta had graded papers at the kitchen table every Sunday evening, was in my name now. There had never been a formal plan written down about what happened to it eventually. It had just been assumed, the way things are assumed between parents and children who love each other and don't say the hard things out loud. I told Patricia I wanted to sell it. I told her something else too. Something that had been sitting in the back of my mind since a conversation I'd had a few months prior with a woman named Deborah Avery. Deborah had been Loretta's classroom aide for the last 4 years of Loretta's teaching career. She was 11 years younger than Loretta, a single mother, and the two of them had developed the kind of friendship that exists between people who spend every school day together in a room full of 9-year-olds. Deborah had shown up at the funeral with her daughter Phoebe, who was then 16 and who had told me quietly, while we were standing by the food table in the fellowship hall, that she wanted to be a teacher, that she'd wanted to be a teacher since she was in Mrs. Briggs's class in 4th grade. I had not forgotten that. I told Patricia I wanted to establish an education scholarship in Loretta's name through Millbrook Elementary's Alumni Foundation, and I wanted the first recipient named specifically, Phoebe Avery, full tuition support for an education degree. And I wanted it structured so that it didn't pass through my estate in any way that Cassie or Derek could contest or redirect. Patricia looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Harold, how sure are you about this?" "As sure as I've been about anything since Loretta died," I said. The third decision was about Cassie's children. She has 2, a boy named Marcus, who's 8, and a girl named June, who's 5. None of this was theirs. None of what was happening between Cassie and Derek and me was something those 2 kids had any hand in, and I was not going to let it become their inheritance problem 20 years from now. I had Patricia set up a separate education trust for each of them, funded from the proceeds of the house sale, held and invested until each child turned 25, at which point it released to them directly for education, housing, or any purpose they chose. Not to Cassie, not to Derek, to Marcus and June when they were old enough to use it without anyone else's hand in the middle. Patricia wrote in a clause because I asked her to specifying that if either parent attempted to petition for early access, redirect the funds, or use the trust's existence as a financial instrument in any legal proceeding, the trust for that child would immediately transfer in full to the Millbrook Elementary Alumni Scholarship Fund. No appeals, no second chances. She asked me if I wanted to soften that language. I told her the language was fine as written. The house sold in 3 weeks. A young couple from Chattanooga, both teachers, which felt like something Loretta would have arranged herself if she'd had the option. Cash offer, no contingencies. I signed the papers on a Wednesday and moved into a rental unit 2 streets from the shop, 1 bedroom, a small porch, more than enough for a man who has learned the difference between a house he's living in and a house he's maintaining for someone else's eventually. I flew to Dublin on a Thursday morning in late June, 9 days before Cassie and Derek and his family were scheduled to arrive. I want to be honest about that timeline, because some people hear it and assume it was strategic, and it wasn't entirely. I'd always planned to get there early, to have a few days to adjust to the time difference and see Dublin before the group portion started. What changed was that the group portion no longer existed, but I kept my early arrival, and I kept my itinerary, and I kept my appointment with the private guide named Seamus, who met me in a car park outside Ennis on a gray Saturday morning and drove me an hour through countryside that looked like somewhere God had paid extra attention. Kilmahill is a small town, the kind of town where the post office and the pub are the two most reliable institutions, and everything else operates on relationship time. Seamus walked me to the church street. Michael's, stone and quiet, with a small cemetery that sloped down toward a field, and I stood in front of it with the enlarged photograph of Bridget in my hands, and I looked at the door and the windows and the way the light came off the stone in the promise. Afternoon, and I said Loretta's name out loud. There was no one nearby to hear it. Seamus had walked a respectful distance and was looking at something on his phone. And I stood there and I let the morning be what it was, which was the end of a promise I had made to a woman who had deserved every good thing and gotten most of them, though not enough time. Cassie's group landed in Dublin 6 days after I arrived. I know the exact day because Susan had given me the overview before I'd restructured everything, and some part of me had been carrying the calendar without meaning to. They had no idea the cottage in County Clare had been cancelled. Day 1 in Dublin. Nothing. I imagined them at the hotel, Derek's parents photographing everything. The kids jet-lagged and wired simultaneously the way children get. Day 2. Nothing. I pictured Cassie sending me a photo of some Georgian door in Dublin and adding a caption that didn't mention the fact that her father wasn't there. Day 3, their car pulled up to the address in County Clare where the cottage was supposed to be and found a private residence with no record of any rental reservation in the name Holloway or Briggs. That's when the calls started. My phone was in my coat pocket, and I was sitting in a small cafe in Ennis, eating brown bread with butter when it first vibrated. I looked at the screen. Cassie. I let it ring. Then Derek. Then Cassie again. I drank my coffee and watched the street outside the window and thought about a woman who had driven Miss Odessa. I thought about Loretta sitting at the kitchen table on Sunday nights with a stack of papers and a red pen, grating with the television on low so she could hear the weather, and how she had never once complained about the work, even when it was the 4th hour of it. The texts started coming in after the calls. Dad, I can't reach Susan, and the cottage address isn't working. Do you have a number? Then, Dad, please call me. Then, we're standing in front of a private house. There's no rental here. Derek is losing his mind. Please. Then, from Derek's number, which he had never used to contact me before in 6 years of being my son-in-law. Harold, call Cassie. This is not the time for whatever this is. I read that one twice. Then I put my phone face down on the cafe table and finished my bread. They sorted out accommodation that night. From what I later learned, a last-minute booking at a bed and breakfast 40 minutes from where the cottage had been. Not what they'd planned. Expensive at late notice. Derek's parents were apparently not quiet about their opinions of the situation. The calls continued through the next 2 days. 17 the first day, 24 by the second. The texts got shorter and more urgent, and then, somewhere in the middle of the second day, went quiet in a way that felt like something had shifted. I answered on the 4th day, a Sunday evening. I was on the small stone patio outside my rental in Ennis with a glass of something local and the sky doing what Irish skies do at 9 o'clock in late June, which is pretend to be afternoon for longer than seems reasonable. Cassie. Her voice, when it came, was not the stretched sound. It was something I hadn't heard from her in a while. It was small. Dad. Where are you? Ennis. Same as I've been. Silence. The cottage, she said. The whole reservation. Susan said it was cancelled from your end weeks ago. It was. Another silence. Longer. Dad. Why? I kept my voice even. Not cold, but level the way a table is level, not warm, just flat and stable. Because I paid for an experience that was redesigned without my input or my consent, and what was left of it wasn't the thing I'd spent 2 years building. So you cancelled it, without telling us. You told me about Derek's parents without asking me, I said. I found out on a Tuesday at 6 in the morning that the trip I built for your mother's memory had been repurposed into a family vacation for your in-laws. I found out by text. I thought it was fitting that you'd find out the same way." She was quiet for a moment, and I heard something in the background that might have been Derek's voice. "The house," she said. "Deborah called me. She said something about a scholarship in Mom's name. Phoebe Avery starts her education degree at UT Knoxville in the fall," I said. "Your mother had that girl in her class when she was 9. She always said Phoebe had a gift for it. Seemed right." "Dad." Her voice cracked slightly on the word. "That was Mom's house. It was my house," I said. "Left to me. And I used it the way your mother would have used it if she'd had the option. Which is to say, I put it towards something that will matter to somebody 20 years from now." "And Marcus and June?" she asked, and I could hear she already knew some of it, which meant Patricia's paperwork had made its way into some conversation I hadn't been part of. "Your children have an education trust each," I said. "Funded, invested, and waiting for them when they're 25. It is not accessible to you or Derek under any circumstances, and there is a clause in the language that ensures if either of you attempts to access it, the entire amount goes to the scholarship fund. I didn't do that to punish Marcus and June. I did it because I know how decisions get made in your house, and I wanted those two kids protected from those decisions in a way I never managed to protect myself." Derek said something louder in the background. Cassie didn't relay it. "That's not fair," she said. "No," I said. "Fair would have been a phone call before you let Derek invite his parents onto a trip I built for your mother. Fair would have been your voice instead of a text at 6 in the morning. I'm not interested in fair at this point. I'm interested in done." She didn't say anything. "I love you, Cassie," I said. "That doesn't change. But I'm done being the part of your life that gets managed. I'm done being the thing that gets adjusted when it's inconvenient." I went to Kilmahill. I stood in front of that church with your great-great-grandmother's photograph in my hands. I said your mother's name out loud in front of a building that meant something to your mother's family before either of us existed. I kept my promise. "That's the part I'll carry." I heard her breathing. "I'm glad you went," she said finally. It was quiet and genuine, and it cost her something to say it, and I recognized that. "I know you are," I said. We didn't say much after that. I let the call end naturally, the way a conversation ends when everything that needed to be said has been said, and neither person wants to manufacture more words to fill the space. I didn't hang up, angry. I hung up, finished. Derek's parents flew home early, from what I understand. The remaining days in Ireland went ahead, and Cassie sent me one photograph, Marcus and June, standing in front of the cliffs of Moher, with their arms out like they were trying to hold the wind. And June's coat was buttoned wrong. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I saved it. I've been back in Maryville for 2 months now. Phoebe Avery starts school in August. Deborah called me the week the acceptance letter came and cried on the phone for about 3 minutes before she could get words out. She said, "Harold, Loretta would be so," and then she couldn't finish, and I told her she didn't have to. "The shop is the same as it always was. I open at 7 on Tuesdays. I close at 5 on Fridays." There's a photograph of Loretta on the wall above the register, the one from our trip to Gatlinburg in 2009, where she's laughing at something I'd said and looking slightly away from the camera, the way she always did, when she was caught off guard by happiness. Cassie calls on Sundays now. Careful, measured calls. She tells me about Marcus's soccer and June's new thing with drawing horses. She doesn't mention Derek's position on things, and I don't ask. I answer when she calls. I keep my voice even. I ask about the kids. I'm not going to tell you there's been some grand reconciliation, because there hasn't. What there's been is a new arrangement, one where I'm not the resource and she's not the manager of it. Whether that grows into something warmer over time is not something I'm holding my breath for, but I'm also not closing the door. What I'll tell you is this. I was 63 years old, standing in front of a stone church in a county I'd never been to, holding a photograph of a woman I'd never met, keeping a promise to a woman I'd spent 31 years being grateful to know, and the only sound was wind off a field, and my own voice saying a name out loud, and there was nothing heavy about it. It was the lightest I had felt since the adjustable bed came back to the rental place, and the living room became a living room again. I didn't need permission for it. I didn't need the trip to be designed by committee, or co-signed by a son-in-law, or approved by people who had never heard of Bridget or County Clare, or the wooden box on a dresser in Knoxville. I needed to go, and I went, and I kept the promise, and that was enough. If you've spent years being generous to someone who has slowly come to treat your generosity like a subscription they're entitled to, I want you to hear this. You are allowed to stop. Stopping is not abandonment. Stopping is not cruelty. Stopping is the moment you decide that the love you have is real enough to survive being honest about its limits. And the people underneath that, someone, the grandchildren, the Phoebes, the ones who never asked for any of it, they can still be protected. They can still receive what you intended. The love doesn't have to stop moving. It just gets to move in a direction you chose. If this story found something in you, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you want to hear more. And tell me down in the comments, what's the one promise you made to someone you loved that you'd have walked across an ocean to keep?